Welcome to English Bookshelf, where every book becomes your new friend and every summary gives you a new lesson. Have you ever noticed how silence scares us more than noise? How an empty room feels heavier than a crowded one? How the moment your phone stops buzzing, your mind starts screaming? We live in a world where being busy is praised, being surrounded is celebrated, and being alone is quietly judged. A world that teaches us, without ever saying it out loud, that if you are alone, something must be wrong with you. And that is exactly where this story begins. This book, The Art of Being Alone by Renuka Gavrani, does not try to fix your loneliness. It doesn't rush to comfort you. It doesn't tell you to move on or find someone or stay positive. Instead, it does something far more powerful. It sits with you. It looks at your loneliness, your silence, your empty evenings, and gently asks, what if being alone isn't the problem? What if the problem is that we were never taught how to be alone? From childhood, we are trained to seek company. We grow up surrounded by voices, family, friends, teachers, classmates. We are taught how to adjust, how to fit in, how to be liked. But no one teaches us how to sit with ourselves. No one teaches us how to face our own thoughts without distraction. And so, the moment life takes people away, when friendships change, relationships end, or routines break, we feel lost. Not because we are alone, but because we never learned how to be. Renuka Gavrani begins by gently breaking one of the biggest lies we've ever believed, that being alone means being lonely. She explains that loneliness is not about the absence of people. Loneliness is about the absence of connection. And that connection doesn't always have to come from the outside. Some of the loneliest people in the world are surrounded by others. You can be in a relationship and still feel invisible. You can sit in a room full of people and feel completely misunderstood. And on the other hand, you can be alone and feel deeply at peace. If you know how to be present with yourself. The book slowly guides us toward this uncomfortable truth. We often use people as distractions. We use conversations, social media, relationships, and noise to avoid sitting with our own emotions. Because when we are alone, everything we've been suppressing starts to surface. The regrets, the fears, the unanswered questions, the parts of ourselves we don't fully accept. Being alone forces us to meet ourselves without filters. And that meeting is terrifying, but also transformative. The author speaks about how society has attached shame to solitude. If you eat alone, people assume you were left out. If you travel alone, they ask if you had no one to go with. If you enjoy your own company, they label you as antisocial or strange. But what if enjoying your own company is actually a sign of emotional maturity? What if the ability to be alone without feeling empty is a form of strength? The book doesn't romanticize loneliness. It acknowledges the pain of it. It accepts that there are nights when solitude feels heavy, when silence echoes too loudly, when memories feel sharper because there's nothing to distract you from them. But instead of running away from that discomfort, Renuka Gavrani invites you to lean into it. She explains that solitude is a mirror. When you are alone, you see yourself more clearly. And sometimes, you won't like what you see. But clarity is the first step toward growth. You start noticing patterns, why you crave validation, why silence scares you, why you settle for connections that don't truly fulfill you. You realize how often you compromise yourself just to avoid being alone. And that realization hurts. But it also sets you free. The book gently emphasizes that being alone is not about isolating yourself from the world. It's about building a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on external approval. It's about becoming someone you don't need to escape from. When you learn how to be alone, relationships stop being a necessity and start becoming a choice. You no longer seek people to fill a void. You seek them to share fullness. Renuka Gavrani talks about how solitude gives you space to think without interruption, space to heal without judgment, Space to understand what you truly want instead of what you were told to want. In that space, you begin to hear your own voice again. Not the voice shaped by expectations, not the voice shaped by fear, but the quiet, honest voice you've been ignoring for years. And once you hear it, everything starts to change. You stop chasing constant company. You stop fearing weekends with no plans. You stop measuring your worth by how many people are around you. You realize that being alone doesn't mean you are unloved. Sometimes, it means you are finally listening. And this is only the beginning. Because the art of being alone is not about withdrawing from life. It's about returning to it with clarity, strength, and self-awareness. There is a phase in life that no one prepares you for. A phase where friendships fade without a fight. Where conversations become shorter. Where people who once felt permanent slowly become distant. And suddenly, you find yourself with more time. And fewer people. This is usually when panic begins. We rush to fill the emptiness. We scroll endlessly. We text people we don't even miss. We stay in conversations that drain us. We cling to relationships that no longer fit. Not because we want them, but because we are afraid of what happens when we are alone. Renuka Gavrani speaks about this fear with quiet honesty. She explains that most of our emotional exhaustion comes not from being alone, but from constantly trying not to be alone. We overextend ourselves. We overexplain. We overgive. All to avoid sitting with ourselves. But solitude has a way of stripping away illusions. When you are alone, there is no audience. No role to play. No version of yourself that exists just to be liked. There is only you, unfiltered and unguarded. And this is where the real work begins. The book explains that loneliness often intensifies after emotional connections end. Not because the other person was irreplaceable, but because you had slowly tied parts of your identity to them. Your routines, your habits, your emotional safety. When they leave, it feels like something has been taken from you. But in truth, you had handed it over willingly. Solitude exposes this truth. It showed you where you became emotionally dependent, where you stopped choosing yourself, where you allowed another person's presence to define your sense of worth. And that realization can feel unbearable at first, because it forces you to ask a painful question. Who am I without the people I revolve around? Renuka Gavrani doesn't offer quick answers. She allows the discomfort to exist. She reminds us that rebuilding yourself takes time. And solitude is not something you master overnight. At first, being alone feels awkward. You don't know what to do with the silence. Your thoughts feel louder. Your emotions feel heavier. But slowly, something shifts. You begin to notice that the silence isn't empty. It's honest. It shows you what you've been avoiding. The grief you never processed. The dreams you postponed. The boundaries you never set. The book explains that solitude is not meant to comfort you immediately. It's meant to wake you up. When you stop distracting yourself, you start observing yourself. You realize how much of your energy went into maintaining connections that were one-sided. How often you stayed available for people who weren't present for you. And for the first time, you stop asking, why don't they choose me? You start asking, why did I abandon myself? This is where solitude becomes powerful. Because once you are alone long enough, you stop seeking validation from the outside. You stop needing constant reassurance that you matter. You begin to build that reassurance within yourself. Renuka Gavrani writes about how solitude teaches self-trust. When you are alone, you learn to make decisions without seeking approval. You learn to sit with uncertainty without running away. You learn that your own presence can be grounding. And this changes the way you approach relationships. You stop entering connections out of fear. You stop staying out of obligation. You stop tolerating emotional crumbs. Because now, being alone feels better than being undervalued. The book also talks about how solitude reveals your emotional patterns. You notice who you miss and why. You realize that sometimes you miss familiarity, not the person. You miss routine, not connection. And that realization hurts. But it also frees you from romanticizing the past. Solitude helps you separate attachment from love. You understand that just because someone once mattered doesn't mean they should still have access to your present. You learn that closure does not always come from conversations. Sometimes, closure comes from understanding yourself better. This is when you start to heal, not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. You begin to enjoy simple moments alone, a walk without music, a meal without your phone, an evening without plans. At first, these moments feel strange. Then they start feeling peaceful. Renuka Gavrani explains that solitude is where emotional independence is born. When you stop relying on others to regulate your feelings, you stop feeling emotionally fragile. You still feel deeply, but you don't fall apart easily. And that's when you realize something important. You were never afraid of being alone. You were afraid of facing yourself. But now, slowly, you are learning. There comes a moment in solitude when something unexpected happens. You stop waiting. You stop waiting for messages that won't come. You stop waiting for people to change. You stop waiting for life to feel like it used to. And that moment is quiet, but powerful. Renuka Gavrani writes about this shift with deep sensitivity. She explains that solitude is not about cutting people off. It's about cutting the unconscious need to be chosen. When you are constantly surrounded by people, you rarely notice how often you compromise yourself just to belong. You laugh when something hurts. You agree when something feels wrong. You stay silent when you should speak. But when you are alone, there is no one to perform for. And slowly, you begin to hear your own voice again. At first, it sounds unfamiliar. It questions things you once accepted. It challenges choices you once defended. This voice asks you why you tolerated inconsistency, why you stayed where effort was one-sided, why you mistook attention for care. Solitude brings clarity, but clarity is not gentle. It forces you to confront the truth that some relationships survived only because you kept shrinking yourself, that some bonds existed only because you were afraid to let go. Renuka Gavrani explains that being alone teaches you emotional boundaries in a way no advice ever can. When you spend time with yourself, you learn how much energy you actually have. You notice how draining certain interactions were. You realize that peace is not something you find in people, it's something you protect. This realization changes everything. You stop answering calls out of guilt. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop chasing conversations that feel forced. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough about yourself. The book talks about how solitude reshapes your relationship with love. Before solitude, love felt urgent. It felt consuming. It felt like something you had to hold onto tightly. After solitude, love feels calmer. You no longer confuse intensity with connection. You no longer romanticize chaos. You no longer believe that love has to hurt to be real. Renuka Gavrani reminds us that when you don't know how to be alone, you often settle for emotional noise instead of emotional safety. You stay busy, not fulfilled. You stay connected, not understood. You stay attached, not aligned. Solitude clears this confusion. It teaches you that love should add to your life, not replace it. That relationships should complement your wholeness, not become your identity. And once you understand this, something profound happens. You stop fearing endings. Because now, endings don't feel like abandonment. They feel like redirection. The book speaks about how solitude heals abandonment wounds. When you learn to be present for yourself, you stop expecting others to fill emotional gaps they never created. You stop seeking constant reassurance. You stop fearing distance. You stop equating availability with love. You begin to trust yourself enough to walk away from what doesn't feel right, without drama, without bitterness. Solitude also teaches patience. You stop rushing connections. You stop forcing closeness. You allow people to reveal who they are over time. Because now, you're not afraid of empty space. Renuka Gavrani beautifully explains that solitude teaches you discernment. You become selective, not cold. You still love deeply. You still care sincerely. But you no longer overextend. You understand that not everyone deserves access to your inner world, and that protecting your peace is not selfish, it's necessary. This is when loneliness transforms. What once felt like isolation begins to feel like freedom. You enjoy your own company without needing to distract yourself. You start doing things because they matter to you, not because they look good to others. You reconnect with forgotten parts of yourself. Your creativity, your curiosity, your intuition, and you realize something quietly revolutionary. You are enough company for yourself. Not forever, not to avoid love, but enough to never settle out of fear again. There is a quiet confidence that solitude builds. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needs to be announced, but the kind that changes the way you walk into rooms, the way you listen, the way you respond. Renuka Gavrani writes that when you learn to be alone, you stop needing to prove anything. You stop competing for attention. You stop measuring your worth through how many people want you around. Because now, your sense of belonging comes from within. The book explains that most emotional insecurity is rooted in dependence. We feel anxious when people pull away because we have attached our stability to their presence. We feel rejected when plans change because we made someone else responsible for our happiness. Solitude quietly dissolves this dependence. When you are comfortable being alone, you don't panic when someone takes space. You don't chase clarity. You don't beg for consistency. You observe, and observation gives you power. You begin to see people as they are, not as who you hope they will become. You notice effort without justifying its absence. You recognize patterns without ignoring them. Renuka Gavrani emphasizes that solitude sharpens intuition. When your mind is no longer crowded with external noise, your inner voice becomes clearer. You feel when something is off. You sense misalignment before it turns into pain. And for the first time, you listen. This is where solitude stops being about aloneness and starts being about alignment. You align your actions with your values. You align your energy with your capacity. You align your relationships with your truth. And that alignment brings peace. The book talks about how solitude heals people-pleasing tendencies. When you spend time alone, you stop adjusting yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-apologizing. You stop trying to be understood by those who never really listened. You learn that being misunderstood is not the worst thing. Being disconnected from yourself is. Renuka Gavrani writes about emotional self-sufficiency not as isolation, but as stability. You no longer rely on others to regulate your mood. You don't need constant interaction to feel alive. You find comfort in your routines, your thoughts, your inner world. And because of this, you stop attracting chaos. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop confusing attention with affection. You stop engaging in emotional push and pull. Because you are no longer empty. The book explains that solitude prepares you for deeper relationships. Not more relationships, but better ones. You start valuing depth over frequency, presence over proximity, consistency over excitement. You are okay with fewer people because the connections you keep are real. And when someone new enters your life, you don't rush. You don't merge immediately. You don't lose yourself in potential. You don't abandon your rhythm to match theirs. You remain rooted. Renuka Gavrani beautifully explains that solitude teaches you how to love without losing yourself. You can care deeply without clinging. You can be open without oversharing. You can commit without disappearing. And this changes the quality of your love. You show up whole, not hoping to be completed. The book also addresses the fear of becoming too independent. The fear that solitude might make you emotionally distant or unavailable. But Renuka Gavrani reassures us. Solitude doesn't harden you. It softens you in the right places. You become gentle with yourself, patient with others, clear with your boundaries. You stop reacting. You start responding. And in this response, there is maturity. The book highlights that solitude teaches emotional regulation. You learn to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. You process emotions instead of suppressing them. You feel sadness without drowning in it. This emotional resilience becomes your anchor. You don't fear silence anymore. You don't fear boredom. You don't fear your own thoughts, because you know how to hold yourself through them. By this point in the journey, solitude no longer feels like a phase you're trying to get through. It feels like a foundation that supports everything else in your life. Your work, your creativity, your relationships, your peace. And in the next part, the book gently leads us to the final understanding that the art of being alone is not about staying alone. It is about choosing connection from a place of wholeness. You can be surrounded by people and still remain centered. You can be loved and still remain whole. You can lose someone and still remain standing. Renuka Gavrani writes that this is the stage where being alone is no longer about physical solitude. It is about emotional independence. You no longer need constant reassurance to feel secure. You no longer need someone to mirror your worth. You no longer need relationships to distract you from yourself. Because now, you know how to sit with your own emotions. The book explains that once you master this, relationships change naturally. You don't chase. You don't cling. You don't overinvest prematurely. You allow connections to unfold at their own pace. And if they leave, it hurts, but it doesn't destroy you. This is one of the most powerful shifts solitude brings. You stop fearing loss. Not because loss becomes painless, but because you trust yourself to survive it. Renuka Gavrani writes about how solitude teaches emotional responsibility. You stop expecting others to heal wounds they didn't create. You stop blaming people for triggering insecurities you never addressed. Instead, you take ownership. You ask yourself difficult questions. Why did this hurt me so deeply? Why did I ignore my instincts? Why did I stay silent when I should have spoken? And instead of judging yourself, you listen. This listening creates self-respect. And self-respect changes your standards. You stop accepting mixed signals. You stop tolerating inconsistency. You stop staying where effort is one-sided. Because now, peace matters more than potential. The book gently emphasizes that solitude helps you redefine love. Love is no longer about intensity or obsession. It is no longer about constant togetherness. It is no longer about proving loyalty through sacrifice. Love becomes about mutual presence, mutual effort, mutual growth. And until that kind of love arrives, you are okay being alone. Not lonely, not bitter, just complete. Renuka Gavrani explains that this is when people often misunderstand you. They may call you distant. They may say you've changed. They may think you've become selective or detached. But what they don't see is the work you've done. They don't see the nights you spent unlearning dependency. They don't see the mornings you chose yourself instead of chasing validation. They don't see the emotional discipline it took to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. Solitude refined you, and refinement often looks like distance to those who never went inward. The book speaks about how solitude teaches you to enjoy life in smaller, quieter ways. You notice sunsets more. You enjoy conversations that don't drain you. You find joy in routines that once felt boring, because your happiness is no longer outsourced. It is internal. Renuka Gavrani also addresses the fear of missing out. The fear that being alone means falling behind, being forgotten, or losing relevance. But solitude reveals a deeper truth. You don't fall behind when you slow down. You don't lose relevance when you choose peace. You don't miss out when you stop forcing yourself into spaces that don't nourish you. You actually find yourself. And once you find yourself, You don't feel the urge to chase anything that costs you your balance. This is where solitude becomes wisdom. You still desire connection, but not at the cost of self-betrayal. You still want love, but not at the cost of your identity. You still care, but not at the cost of your peace. And the book gently reminds us, being alone taught you how to choose better, not how to stay alone forever. There is a stillness at the end of this journey. Not emptiness, not loneliness, but a deep sense of arrival. Renuka Gavrani closes the art of being alone by reminding us that solitude was never meant to isolate us from the world. It was meant to reconnect us with ourselves. By now, being alone no longer feels like something you fear. It feels like a place you can return to. You understand that solitude is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-awareness. It is the space where you learned to hear your own needs, respect your own limits, and honor your own pace. The book gently shows that once you are rooted in yourself, you stop forcing life to look a certain way. You stop rushing timelines. You stop comparing journeys. You stop measuring your worth by external milestones. Because you are no longer living from lack. You are living from alignment. Renuka Gavrani explains that the most beautiful relationships are not formed when you are desperate for connection, but when you are contained in your own company. When you don't need someone to save you. When you don't need someone to complete you. When you don't need someone to distract you from yourself. That is when love becomes choice, not escape. The book makes it clear, being alone teaches you discernment. You don't open your heart quickly, but you open it honestly. You don't give your energy away easily, but you give it fully when it feels right. You stop romanticizing people who are emotionally unavailable. You stop chasing clarity from those who avoid it. You stop staying where you feel uncertain. Because now, peace is familiar, and you protect what is familiar. Renuka Gavrani writes that solitude teaches you to sit with life as it is, without constantly trying to change it. You learn to be present in quiet moments. You learn to appreciate stillness. You learn that not every chapter needs to be loud to be meaningful. This presence becomes your grounding. You no longer seek distractions to escape discomfort. You no longer numb emotions to avoid pain. You allow yourself to feel without losing yourself in feeling. This is emotional maturity. The book ends by reframing solitude as a lifelong skill. There will be phases in your life when people leave, when plans fall apart, when silence returns. But now, silence does not scare you, because you know how to meet yourself there. Renuka Gavrani leaves us with a powerful understanding. Being alone didn't make you stronger in a dramatic way. It made you honest. It made you intentional. It made you self-aware. And those qualities shape a life that feels authentic. You didn't lose people by learning to be alone. You found yourself. And once you find yourself, you no longer settle for relationships that require you to disappear. You choose connection, but not at the cost of your peace. You choose love, but not at the cost of your identity. You choose people, but you never abandon yourself again. That is the art, not isolation, not detachment, but wholeness. And that is why The Art of Being Alone is not a book about loneliness. It is a book about coming home to yourself. A reminder that your presence is enough. Your company is valuable. And your life does not begin when someone else enters it. It begins when you stop running from yourself. If this story resonated with you, remember this. You are not alone because you are missing something. You are alone because you are becoming someone. And becoming takes time. This was The Art of Being Alone by Renuka Gavrani. A book for those who are learning to sit with themselves and discovering that they were never empty to begin with, where every story leaves a thought and every summary gives you a new lesson. If this video inspired you, subscribe to English Bookshelf for more stories, more learning, and more inspiration. Until the next book, keep reading, keep growing, and keep believing in yourself.